Good morning, all. Good to see this number out with us this morning. I always wonder the morning after we set our clocks, how many get confused or maybe forget to set their clock, but looks like everybody pretty well did this time. We appreciate very much your presence with us this morning. Our study this morning will be in the 28th chapter of the book of Acts. Bad news is we're almost out of time in this quarter. The good news is we're about to finish up, and in the next 2 weeks we should be able to do that. I have compared Paul's voyage to Rome to our voyage on the Sea of Life. But at least one other parallel might be drawn. Like Paul, we don't always find ourselves where we expected or want to be. If you should look at a map of Paul's journey to Rome and mentally draw a straight line from Caesarea, where the journey began, to Rome, where the journey ended, and you compare that line with the actual route his ship took, north up the coast, west close to the coast of what is now Turkey, south to the island of Crete, west to Fair Havens, finally south again, then west with some north and east mixed in, as the ship was driven to and fro, being then grounded on a reef off the coast of the island of Malta. Only after considerable detours did the voyages head north again toward Rome. You know, life is that way sometimes for many of us. Now, we can look at some people's lives and chart them just as straight lines, starting with their aims in life and progressing unerringly to the fulfillment of their goals. But others, like Paul's voyage, take unexpected twists and turns. I know my life has been that way, some things being those over which I had no control, but others, unfortunately, the result of things which I myself initiated. But we struggle sometimes with these things, and we find ourselves where we did not actually expect or want to be. When we do, what should we do about it? What can we do about it? When Paul found himself on the island of Malta, he was definitely not where he wanted to be. He wanted to be in Rome. After his arrest in Jerusalem, the Lord assured him that he would witness in Rome. The apostle had appealed to Caesar and started toward Rome. On that journey, God had promised him that he would stand before Caesar. Paul had every right to expect to be in the imperial city. Instead, he found himself stuck on a tiny island hundreds of miles away from Rome, with winter coming on and no possibility of getting off that island till spring. When Paul found himself where he did not want to be, what did he do? Did he behave like we sometimes do? Did he complain and sulk? Did he remain miserable and make everyone around him miserable? We want to see this morning how Paul responded to his situation. Now, Going back, imagine Paul lying exhausted on that beach, gasping for breath, while waterlogged survivors struggle onto the beach behind him. These 276 men are soaked. They're hungry. They're shivering, huddling together and looking more like human debris tossed up from the ocean. What's worse, they then turn to watch as the churning sea slowly dissolves their ship. What do you suppose their thoughts were? Imagine what the ship's owner might have been thinking. His ship and cargo were lost. But I believe that most of them, including Paul, were just thankful to be alive. In verse 1, Luke recorded, "Now, when they had escaped, they then found out that the island was called Malta." Malta, a rugged little island, 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. This island is 58 miles south of Sicily, in the Mediterranean Sea between Italy and North Africa. It had been settled at one time by Phoenician traders, but in BC 218, it had come under Roman rule. Ironically, the name Malta meant refuge in the Canaanite language. The name might have been given by Phoenician sailors who actually found refuge on that island. But now, the island did truly provide refuge for Paul and for his fellow travelers. When we find ourselves where we really don't want to be, we need to have a positive attitude nevertheless. We can't always choose our location, but we can choose what kind of attitude we have. And whatever happens, it could be worse. Now, Paul and the others are cold and wet and tired, but they could have been dead. Sometimes we just need to realize that things could have been much worse. This morning, we're going to see how Paul and his fellow voyagers not only made the best of their situation, but in the process accomplished much good. As we look around the rain-swept beach of the island of Malta, we see that the shipwreck victims are not alone. Someone on the island had apparently spotted the ship offshore and spread the word. Those swimming or floating to shore were being met by a friendly welcoming committee. Verse 2 tells us, "And the natives showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and made us all welcome because of the rain that was falling and because of the cold." Now, it was late October or early November. It would have been around 50 degrees Fahrenheit in that part of the Mediterranean. Chilly enough, especially for a person who is soaked, exhausted, and standing in a driving rain. To the waterlogged people who had just ridden a wind-whipped roller coaster for 2 weeks, how warm that fire must have felt, emotionally as well as physically. Now, the kindness of these natives was extraordinary because it was common for landlocked pirates to wait for shipwrecks and prey on the victims. Sometimes they killed them. Sometimes they made slaves of them. They always at least robbed them and stole the cargo from the doomed ship. Can you imagine what a pleasant surprise it was for these men to be treated so hospitably by the natives of Malta? Could it have been the working of God's providence still once again? I think so. I need to say a word about the term natives right here. Since the King James Version uses the term barbarians, we might be tempted to picture those who welcomed this ship as a band of savages. Actually, the King James Version has an accurate translation here because the original Greek text has the term meaning barbarian. However, this term, barbarian, might leave the wrong impression with some people. To the Greek, the barbarian was just a man who spoke in an unintelligible foreign language, not the Greek tongue. So, in Luke's day, the term barbarian did not mean uncultured, crude, savage, or unsophisticated, as we might think of it today. It simply meant that the individual preferred to speak his own language. In fact, as part of the Roman province of Sicily, Malta was highly civilized. According to historians, in Paul's day, the island was known for its prosperity and its residential architecture. The description of islanders by the NIV is actually a good description of those who received Paul and his fellow shipmates with kindness. So we see those friendly and concerned islanders, and we see the massive fire blazing high into the overcast sky, a fire big enough to dry almost 300 soaked survivors. It's been a long time since those from the ship had been either dry or warm. Now, when challenges come into our lives, sometimes we're more likely to look at them as problems rather than opportunities. But if we look hard enough, we should realize that not only could it be worse, but we can actually find good in the situation. Then the first part of verse 3 tells us, "But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire." William Barclay made this statement about Paul. Paul was a man who could not bear to be doing nothing. There was a bonfire to be kept alight, and Paul was gathering brushwood for it. J.W. McGarvey made this observation about Paul. Paul was not a preacher after the style of the modern-day clergyman who is particular not to soil his hands with menial labor and who expects everybody to be ready to serve him while he preserves his dignity and looks on. Now, it's kind of funny, but I can really relate to that. This old former preacher spent 30 years preaching for small country congregations, where you not only preached 2 sermons and taught classes every week, you also cleaned the building, mowed the yard, ran the bulletin, chaired the business meetings, kept the minutes of those meetings, and made a lot of decisions that you shouldn't have been making. Well, the Apostle Paul had spent a lifetime working with his hands. so he was not too good to gather firewood. No task is too small for the servant of God who has the mind of Christ. Philippians 1:13. Sometimes we complain about a situation instead of doing what we can to make the best of it. But it's always better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. But then suddenly we see the process of keeping the fire going is interrupted as all eyes are fixed in horror on the apostle. The last part of verse 3 says, "A viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand." Because of the cold, this snake had apparently been lying dormant in a stack of brush which Paul had picked up for the fire. The heat of the fire revived that serpent, and it had struck Paul. Now it hung grotesquely from his hand, its fangs buried in his flesh. We see the situation becoming worse for Paul as murmuring starts to circle the fire. Now, these islanders were civilized, but they still held on to the superstitions of the pagan mind. When the natives saw the creature hanging from Paul's hand, they began to say to one another, as verse 4 tells us, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he has escaped the sea, yet justice does not allow to live." Possibly they had heard that Paul was a prisoner. When they saw him bitten, they concluded that he must be guilty of a heinous crime and that the deadly snake was an instrument of the gods to make sure he didn't escape unscathed. Now, most of us are terrified at just the thought of being bitten by a snake, poisonous or otherwise. Amazingly, though, Paul remained calm. Verse 5 says, "But he shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm." When Jesus sent out the 70, he told them in Luke 10, verse 19, "Behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." When he gave the Great Commission, he promised the apostles in Mark 16, beginning at verse 17, "And these signs will follow those who believe. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will take up serpents, and if they drink anything deadly, it will by no means hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover." Paul was simply performing one of the signs of a true apostle, predicted by Jesus himself. Paul had thus far suffered no harm, but the islanders were still convinced that at any time things would abruptly change. Verse 6 says, "However, they were expecting that he would swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had looked for a long time and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god." Well, after waiting and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they completely changed their minds. They no longer thought that he was a criminal, condemned criminal, But then they began to say the opposite extreme, that he was actually a god. But notice that Paul, like happened at Lystra, he remained unruffled. Whether people said he was a god or a murderer. This deadly viper was probably one of Satan's last efforts to keep Paul from reaching Rome. God, however, used this incident for his own purposes. God demonstrated to everybody who had been on that ship that